Don Perry produced the music.
Lester's an orphan who's very unusual. Instead of a house, he lives in a locker in a train station.
The kid picked the triple.
And he has a special talent.
He's a crook.
That can make him rich.
I want that money back.
And get him in trouble. 20th Century Fox presents Gary Coleman, smaller than ever. And in his first motion picture role, he's on the right track. Starring Maureen Stapleton, Michael Lembeck, Lisa Eilbacher, Bill Russell, Herb Edelman, and Norman Fell.
We love Lester.
As the mayor. On the right track.
Last time we touched on it a little bit, and you said you might have a short answer or two, but we wanted to touch on you're working with Gary Coleman. Maybe like that, because we know we did the Fantastic World of DC Collins and the other Gary Coleman, and Playing with Fire and Kid with a Broken Halo and such. So
yeah,
just curious how that came about, because anything Gary Coleman is just 80s gem that people are love to hear about nowadays.
Well, that was an interesting situation. The producer on I did four films with him. One was a TV movie, but the first one I did was On the Right Track in 1981. And the producer was Ron Jacobs, who was nephew of Danny Thomas, who did all those great Danny Thomas production and shows and everything. But I was contacted by Jim Begg, who was a producer. And here's how things go round and round. I was working with the Nelsons, with David Nelson. Jim Begg had been an actor on the Ozzie and Harriet show. And so he called Dave and asked about somebody that could do the music, produce it. Dave recommended me. So there I was with the Gary Coleman projects. I feel overall, I have to say, it was bittersweet. It was a little sad for me. Gary was 13 years old on that first one. He was co-owner of the production company, Zephyr Productions. And he was being advised by his step-parents and lawyers and advisors. And he was a 13-year-old kid. And I got the same feeling with him that I got with the Jackson 5. Michael Jackson was 12 or 13 when I did the first concerts. And I'll never forget, we were at the same hotel in Fresno, and they asked me if I wanted to ride over to the arena with them, and we got in this big limo, and the brothers were there with the dad, and I looked at Michael, and he was a kid, and I thought, he's never been a kid. He was such a huge star, he couldn't go anywhere, he was mobbed. Gary Coleman, people don't remember, in the late 70s and 80s, VHS, if anybody remembers that, VHS music, he was number one on of the 100 greatest kid stars. And in 78, he was making $100,000 an episode on Different Strokes. Huge amounts of money he was making. But I felt that he was overwhelmed by it. He was doing these things, these shows. He was a kid. He was great at what he did. And in the end, it's tragic that I think at the end of that run, they left him with about 25% of the money he earned, and he had to sue his family, sue his agents. And by the late 90s, he was bankrupt. He was working in a hobby store. He loved to do model trains and everything. He wanted to be close to what he was doing. But he was working in the store. He was working as a security guard at a mall at one point. Sad thing. And looking back on it, tremendous talent. He had a thing that made people love him. But here he was, a kid in an adult world, owning a production company and doing these shows. So it's hard for me to have warm memories when I see how that ended up. But at the time, those pictures were a lot of fun to do. And he was fun. He was a nice kid, and he liked the people around him and what he was doing. He was just misguided, which is a sad situation. But again, I think a lot of child actors had that same problem.
Yeah, it's definitely, unfortunately, a common theme, especially in the 80s and the 90s, you know, kids like Macaulay
Right.
Culkin and stuff like that. They just, yeah, their parents or their, you know, they just screw them out of all that money, and it's just, it never, you know, it's just awful because obviously
Yeah.
they're not, I mean, and when that's all said and done, you know, Barry never talked to his family after that again. So,
Yeah,
all
it's-
around, it's just a bummer.
Yeah, a sad situation for someone who really made a lot of people happy. That TV show was huge, and those pictures, even though they weren't reviewed well, were good at the box office. And so, you know, he did his job, and he made people happy. And unfortunately, he wasn't able to enjoy it himself.
Right. Yeah, that's a bummer. I know.
You know,
I
didn't
know.
mean to get into a down thing about that, but that's you know, you asked my opinion and feeling, and that's.
No, yeah, no, not at all. That's fine. Yeah. I was just curious because you know, Jason Bateman was in that movie. He has the coolest name, Addison Cromwell, and he's also in another movie that you did later on. I Just Want to Dance with his sister Justine Bateman. I was just curious. Did you meet him at all, or did you have any experience with him?
I did. I did. That was Can You Feel Me Dancing? That was.
Can You Feel Me Dancing? I'm sorry. Yeah.
She played a blind gal that comes out of her shell through dancing and meeting, you know, the love of her life. But they were both great. She was very gracious. He was involved there. He was around. That was one of those that we were involved in the filming because we had to do music to the scenes. A lot of times, I never even met the actor in a picture I did because they were gone. Everything had been reshot. All we saw was the end result, and we did the music. So a lot of people I'd love to have met weren't there, you know. But they were there on set. We worked closely with her, with the timing of the dancing and all that. Just a great experience. Both good people. They, you know, they were in the business for a long time and very young, but they didn't seem affected by it. They just, it was a job to them, and they treated everybody as co-workers. So good memories of working with them. Also, you know, Valerie Bertinelli, who was married to Eddie Van Halen, I did a picture with her, and she was super sweet. She was really a nice gal. I was glad I met her. And, of course, she recommended Eddie to do a theme, and it was kind of nice to work with Eddie Van Halen on a theme song for a TV movie. So a lot of very gracious people who were pretty much at the top of their game then. But whatever the question was, yes, nice people.
Yeah, that was a surprising movie. I put it on and went into it, and Justine Bateman just blew me away. Actually, she turned in a really powerhouse performance, and it's, you know, it's not your typical after school special movie. And it was nice to see you know, Jason Bateman play her brother too. I thought that was, you know, sort of life imitating art type of thing was nice to watch. But
yeah,
it
I think they had to cast that, and he had to go through auditions for it. And no, I'm kidding.
That's so funny. Can you read for the part, please? That's too funny.
Just to go back to Gary Coleman real quick. I mean, he was just so influential to us as children, especially me. I'm a little older than Dustin, you know, 8-9 years older. But two of those movies, On the Right Track and Jimmy the Kid, were both theatrical films, and then all the other ones were television movies, if I remember correctly. But
Right.
Yeah, because I just have a memory of being like 7 years old and my mom taking me to see On the Right Track. And I remember thinking it was the coolest thing, and I wanted to live in a locker and a train station like he did. And like, I remember just being like so into it, you know? And like, I just wanted to because, you know, a lot of younger people probably nowadays and stuff don't know who Gary Coleman is, but he was, you know, he was like my Macaulay Culkin when I was a kid, or, you know,
Right.
my dad's Jerry Mathers when he was a kid, you know, or something.
Right.
So I just wanted to just make that comment.
Those people you mentioned had a charm that just jumped right off the screen. at you, and you can't teach that. So
Absolutely.
he just had that, and whether the pictures were good or not, he carried them. You went to see Gary Coleman,
Yeah.
and he always delivered. So good memories with that.
I was just curious because you touched upon it in James Borsa's interview. I know that so Fred Dreyer, that was in the Fantastic World of DC Collins, was on a show, Hunter, growing up, which was wildly successful. I was curious about you working with Mike Post. I know you did some work with him, and he was sort of the background music to all of our childhood growing up on a lot of stuff because he worked on so many 80s shows that were so popular, too.
Yeah, he was a legend in TV, and without getting into a long story, I tell a story in my book that we were with the same agent, and I got a job picture called Running Brave with Robbie Benson, based on a true story of an Olympic athlete who was off the reservation. And they had a lot of money. Usually they don't have a lot of money in independent films, and they wanted the top composer they could get. And we suggested from the beginning Mike Post. And they said, oh, no, he's a TV guy. I know he's had all of these hits, Magnum P.I. and Hawaii Five-0 and, all of those. But we want a film composer. And they interviewed about 4 or 5 top guys. I mean, I'm talking guys with Academy Awards. And they had about 5 people to make a decision. And these composers came in, and they would say, well, what do you think? They'd look at the movie, and the composer would start talking about music, and I could see their eyes roll back in their heads because they can visualize everything else. You can read a script, you can watch dailies and watch an actor, but they can't visualize music. So they couldn't make up their mind. 4 or 5 guys coming in, and they'd say, who else you got? So finally they interviewed Mike, and they started with Mike. What do you think? And Mike turned it around and he said, well, what do you guys think? And one guy said, well, we want it to sound like Reservation, but not too much ethnic, and we want big scores, this or that. The other guy said, we want this. It was all different stuff. And Mike looked at him and he said, you guys are right on it. He said, if you had said anything else, I'd have walked out this door and not taken the job. But we're right in sync. We're thinking the same way. I'll take the job. I'll see you on Monday. And he walked out the door. And they all looked around and saying, what the hell just happened? But basically, Mike hired himself. I say this in all my years in the business. He's the only composer that ever hired himself for a job. and he came through. He did a great score. But he was so confident in what he could do. And working with him was like total pro. I can't say he was the most fun guy because he was very serious about what he did, and he wanted to make it right. But he was great to work with because total pro, big orchestra, got the job done. There's a scene at the end where Robbie Benson wins the race, and the climax to that race, the score he did at that point is one of the most exciting things I've seen in a scene in all my years. So wow. It was amazing working with him, but as I said, he hired himself.
There's something to be said about people who have to do that much work consistently, working in like episodic television. Like you're just constantly cranking out work. And,
right.
I mean, when you're that on it, I would imagine that, big or little project doesn't matter. You're always in the zone, and so you're just going to be cranking stuff out.
Yeah, we had a different thing on our series, Grizzly Adams. We were cranking them out too, along with a lot of other stuff. But in that situation, I was working with people who used humor to break the tension. So those were some of the most fun sessions and years I spent with, again, Bob Summers and Andy and Smitty Price, guys that worked on almost the 20 years that I worked with Sun Classic. We never had a session that we didn't have a little fun on. So that was a counterpoint to a lot of people that are so serious that you can't joke. That's why I had that little plaque made for me that said "Shut Up, Don" when I work with those kind of people. It was hard for me to do because you have to bite your tongue sometimes.
Yes. All those movies, though, Life and Times of Grizzly Adams, Last Mohican, The Deer Slayer, the Search of a Golden Sky, they're also beautifully shot outdoors, type of movies with just a real beautiful score. And I encourage anybody who's in those type of movies to really just check them out, because they're a treat to watch. Just based on just the cinematography and just the music alone it's fantastic to watch.
Well, I know we're up against a time thing, but since you mentioned that, Sun Classic, that whole experience, to tell you how those things happen, I did a picture, 30 Dangerous Seconds, in 1973, and a gal named Sharon Miller was a script supervisor on that. And a great gal, and 3 years later, she called me. She was working as an editor, sound editor, for a small company out of Salt Lake City. And they had just done a picture called The Life and Times of Grizzly Adams. They were doing a new picture called The Adventures of Frontier Fremont, which expanded on those characters and became the pilot for the series. But to give you an idea, the head of that company was Chuck Sellier. And over the years, I did over 50 films with him and 7 TV series and a lot of other projects. He was a genius. He did pioneered what they called four-walling, where they would rent a theater for a set price and collect all the money themselves. They paid the theater a flat rate. One of the pictures, second picture I did for him, was In Search of Noah's Ark, a documentary. And he told me at that time he spent $500,000 in production and $5 million in promotion and, renting theaters and everything. It did $50 million off that $5 million investment. So we ended up with over 50 films. At one point, he had 10 of the top grossing independent films, 5 of them in the top 25. So he was a genius at marketing, but also in finding talent. So I'll run it down real quick for you because I made some quick notes. Sharon Miller, she was a sound editor. She went on to directing. 83, she won an Emmy for directing after-school specials. I think she was the first woman director to win an Emmy, daytime Emmy. Ended up doing Cagney and Lacey. She was the editor on that first film. Dick Friedenberg, the director on that, he went on to get an Emmy nomination as a writer with Ron Howard in 81 for Bitter Harvest. He got an Emmy as a producer-writer for The Promise with James Gardner. Oscar nomination for River Runs Through It with Robert Redford. Dave O'Malley was a writer on that. He became a producer on shows like Mork and Mindy and Jim Stafford Show. Mork and Mindy pretty much introduced Robin Williams in that character. So he was on that show. So, we had a lot of people. John Niss, who was an editor, ended up being a producer on Vegas and Numbers and The Profiler. And then probably the biggest guy to come out of it was Jim Conway. I encourage people, because short of time, go to jameslconway.com and see what this guy has done. I did about 9 or 10 shows that he was a producer on, 4 or 5 that he was a writer, 15 on the director. He did Boogans, which was in 81 was one of the cult favorites, notable because we were working with a family company. He met his wife, and she starred on that, Rebecca Balding, and it was the first nude scene in one of those. But he's still working. He's current show, I think, is The Magicians. He did Charms, Titan, Burke's Law, 90210. He was an executive producer for Aaron Spelling for shows like Melrose Place and Beverly Hills 90210. So all of these people came out of that one little low-budget company and worked on those first 2 films, not to mention cameramen and, like you say, it was beautifully filmed. Technicians all went on to pretty good Hollywood careers. So that was a chance encounter on one low-budget picture that built my career, but also those people I mentioned and a lot more that that I didn't, that were on those crews. So if you want to talk about a thumbnail about what happened on what made your career, it was Chuck Sellier and Sun Classic. I became their music department independently for almost 20 years, like I said. So out of one little project. And that's the other life lesson, take the job.
I've got my eyes on you.
Don Perry produced the music.